Okay, we're ready for the next panel to start. We want to welcome everybody who is here and everybody who is streaming online. This panel is a comparative approaches to prevention, a 5-country ministerial approach. We have 2 people here. Hala is going to be the moderator. She is with the United States government. She is in Washington. Vanessa is here. She is from Canada. And we have on the screens Tim and Andy. Tim is in Australia, and Andy is in New Zealand. So this is a very interesting panel of people both here and abroad, and we want to thank you all. And Hala, I'll let you take over. The biographies are in detail in those books, but everybody will give a brief introduction of themselves, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. So I'll start the panel by saying my name is Hala First. I'm the Associate Director for Strategic Engagement at the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. In your agenda, you'll see that I am supposed to be John Piccarelli. I am not, in fact, John Piccarelli, who has come down ill, whereas I have merely lost my voice. So if you'll all bear with me, our AV technicians, this is a special treat for them, I'm positive. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to quickly introduce, with formal titles, each of my co-panelists, and then we're just going to go into a little bit of what we each do all day, and then we will go into some questions, and then hopefully we can take some questions from the audience. I was supposed to be given an iPad with questions on it, which will magically appear from the audience. So first up, to my left, is Vanessa Sima. She is the Policy Manager at the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence for Public Safety Canada. And on the screen, you'll see Andy George, the Counterterrorism Strategic Coordinator with New Zealand's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and Tim Roy, the Assistant Secretary of Countering Violent Extremism of the Countering Violent Extremism branch within the Australian Department of Home Affairs. So we're lucky to have these folks here with us today, and we're excited to share with you all a little bit about how each of our nations approaches the question of prevention. We were going to be joined also by the final member of the fifth Beatle, as it were, within the 5-country Ministerial, our partner from the UK. Thank you so much. I told you it happened like magic. But unfortunately, because of the Queen's passing, he was unable to come. So we'll just have to make stuff up about him while he's gone. So let me turn first over to Vanessa to share a little bit about the work of the Canada Centre.
Great, thanks Hala, and good afternoon everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So I thought I would start with making a few remarks on what it is the Canada Centre does. So the Canada Centre was launched 5 years ago as part of the Government of Canada's Centre of Excellence on Countering Radicalization to Violence and Prevention of Violent Extremism. So our work, as we heard earlier this morning, is very much distinct from but complementary to law enforcement, national security, and criminal justice approaches. While CRV is very much still sort of a nascent discipline, I would say, of prevention in Canada, it's one of really growing interest for our government. And when we speak of prevention, we're really referring to scientific-based approaches to prevention. So similar to what we see in crime prevention, community safety, and social and public health. So following the Canada Centre's launch here in 2018, we released our national strategy on countering radicalization to violence. Much of the Canada Centre's work currently is predicated on the 3 principles that were espoused in the strategy. So the first of which is building, sharing, and using knowledge. As I mentioned, as a centre of excellence, that's very much the essence of what we do is really trying to build that evidence base and understand the scope and some of the potential means to address violent extremism in Canada. In this capacity, we support research that tries to understand what some of the on-ramps are and off-ramps along the spectrum. Secondly, addressing radicalization to violence in the online space is another growing issue for my co-panelists and as well for Canada. So we work in this capacity very closely with our Department of Heritage partners on the development of a legislative and regulatory framework to address online harms. And thirdly, we do quite a bit of work on the supporting of frontline interventions. So we do this primarily through the funding of our Grants and Contributions Fund, which is called our Community Resilience Fund. So through this fund, we've funded to date a number of 48 projects in total, and really looking at research and funding frontline practitioners in this space to address radicalization to violence. So having said that, it's also important to note that while we support this prevention work, we actually do not work directly with individuals who are either at risk or have already radicalized to violence. But again, rather through our Grants and Contributions Fund, the CRF, we fund work to support this. And finally, I just want to mention, of course, the close work that we do with our allies. We work very closely in various multilateral fora, including the G7, the GIFCT, which is the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, the Christchurch Call to Action, and of course, as you know, we're very closely with our partners in the Five Eyes community. Particularly with respect to the work that we do with our Five Eyes, we work quite collaboratively and closely with Five Eyes on, for example, the 5-country research and development initiative, which seeks to collaborate on best practices in research vis-a-vis CRV. Also the Digital Industry Engagement Senior Officials Group, that's always a mouthful, which seeks to work collaboratively amongst the Five Eyes on terrorist and extremist use of the internet. And finally, the CVE Working Group, which also works closely together on issues germane to ideologically motivated violent extremism and terrorism. So maybe I'll pause there with that sort of bird's eye view, Hala, and turn it back to you. But that's sort of the quick and dirty of what we do on our end.
Thank you so much. And thank you for outlining so many of the ways that we work together there at the bottom of your remarks. I think that you'll hear that universally across all of us today about those bodies that we engage with, like the GIFCT, like the DISOC. Andy, I'm going to send it over to you because you're first on my screen.
Thanks, Hala. Kia ora and good morning, everybody. From Wellington here in New Zealand. I'm Andy George and I'm New Zealand's Counter-Terrorism Strategic Coordinator. So I work within the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet here. And the role of that department on national security is to provide the leadership, advice, support and coordination of all of the government's national security priorities and risks, obviously of which terrorism and violent extremism and the associated aspects of hate all form a part. So we're responsible also for bringing agencies together to respond if a terrorist attack or an incident occurs. My role specifically within that is to provide leadership on all of our work to address terrorism and violent extremism. I'm responsible for ensuring that our national strategy on this work is set and understood, and for coordinating the work across government to deliver that strategy. So formally, this means I provide advice to ministers and chief executives. I chair our main counter-terrorism coordination committee and I lead efforts to increase our capabilities. But much more informally and much more importantly, I think my role really is to connect the various parts of New Zealand's system, our counter-terrorism system, the traditional law enforcement and security agencies that have always worked in this space, but increasingly all of the social sector, education, health, well-being agencies that are working at all stages, from addressing the underlying causes through to responding and helping people recover through a victim-centric approach should an incident occur. And that includes all of the work that goes on outside government as well. And we'll talk, I think, a lot about an all-of-society approach, certainly from our side, that we're taking on this. The overall aim of our national strategy, our countering terrorism and violent extremism strategy, is bringing our nation together to protect all New Zealanders from terrorism and violent extremism of all kinds. So the strategy is about working together, in particular, on those prevention aspects, and very deliberately about all kinds of terrorism and violent extremism. Whilst also ensuring that we have the systems and the capabilities in place to act early and respond if we're needed. So a fourfold approach to our national security counterterrorism strategy. Firstly, to understand so that we're aware and informed, and like the Canada Centre, we've just established a National Centre of Research Excellence in this area, so the research and the understanding is central to our approach. Then working together, really emphasising that partnerships are key across a whole range of different sectors inside government, but across our society. Prevention, as you'd expect, and this is our priority. We'll talk a lot about that, as well as that being ready to respond and recover so we're prepared and can support victims in particular. So our strategy emphasises that everyone has a really important role to play in prevention and in the countering violence extremism work. We, like Canada, really emphasise as well the international aspects of this. These are global challenges that we all need to work together on, in particular with around the internet, which has just meant that borders no longer really exist on a lot of the forms of ideology and the ideas around this. So a real pleasure to be with you all today and to discuss these really crucial issues that cause so much harm to our communities. I wish I could be there in Pittsburgh with you, but welcome from New Zealand.
Thanks so much, Andy. And then Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Hala, and good morning, colleagues, and good morning, everybody. Great to be with you this morning. In terms of the Australian approach, my CVE branch that sits within the Counter-Terrorism Coordination Centre in the Department of Home Affairs, really our work spans the full spectrum between broader social cohesion policy and traditional counterterrorism and law enforcement approaches. The Department of Home Affairs coordinates Australia's CVE efforts across federal government agencies, state and territory governments, the private sector, as well as non-government organisations. We refer to this approach as being nationally coordinated and locally delivered, given it's ultimately local services and the community that's best placed to tailor programs that will meet the needs of an individual that might be radicalised into violence in the community in which they're a part. Our strategy actually sits within the broader Australian National Counterterrorism Strategy, which was refreshed earlier this year, but really spans, as I said, that full spectrum of broader social cohesion work, as well as the sort of the counterterrorism and law enforcement approaches. So we work really collaboratively with the states and territories, I think similar to the Canadian model, where we really have a program framework that funds delivery within communities. And it funds a range of initiatives and objectives, including early intervention to disengage people from violent extremism, rehabilitation and reintegration of hardened offenders or violent extremists, preventing the circulation of extremist materials, particularly online, and delivering positive alternative narratives to counter the appeal of extremism. So just, I guess, a few of the ways that we do that. We disengage people from violent extremism through our national intervention program, the Living Safe Together intervention program. And we're responsible for administering that program at the national level. We set national objectives, governance arrangements, and provide support for training and research. This includes provision of funding for states and territories to support program delivery, as well as funding CVE coordinators based in each state and territory. The program aims to reduce the risk of violent extremism in Australia by identifying those who are at risk of radicalising and referring them to relevant support services where they exist within communities. Participation in that intervention program is voluntary, and it aims to reconnect participants with their families and communities through tailored case management plans designed to really address the root causes of radicalisation to violent extremism. Our programs also aim to rehabilitate individuals who may have already engaged in violent extremism and reintegrate them into mainstream society to reduce the risk of future violence. This can include individuals who are convicted terrorism offenders or might be violent offenders who have radicalised in prison, or potentially individuals or their families who may return from conflict zones. Another thing we do is prevent the circulation of extremist materials online through establishing mechanisms for reporting content to relevant providers, working with industry to take down that content, and engaging community leaders to develop alternative positive narratives and strategic communication products that really focus on Australian values, as well as empowering communities to contribute to delivering these narratives themselves. We've also got dedicated strategic communications programs to counter the appeal of both religiously and ideologically motivated violent extremism, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about those later on. And I might just mention we've got a few new CVE initiatives the Australian government funded us to establish at the start of this year, including expanding some of our existing programs as well as creating new ones, which are really aimed at responding to the changing threat environment, including the growth of ideologically motivated violent extremism, increasing prevalence of youth radicalisation, which currently constitutes, I think, almost 20% of participants in our early intervention program are minors, and this number is increasing. And we're increasingly seeing dissemination of extremist narratives and radicalisation happening online, which I know is a common feature of the environment right across the globe. I mean, that's always been a steady increase, but I think COVID's seen an uptick in that activity happening online. So really those initiatives have been crafted to address some of those features of the current threat environment, including the fact that unlike religiously motivated violent extremism, our agencies are seeing that IMVE is more geographically dispersed. And so we're expanding our programs to focus on rural and regional areas in Australia to ensuring we're providing the necessary support for individuals and communities outside urban centres. We're expanding our existing early intervention package. We're establishing expanded high-risk extremist packages and have also funded the development of a CVE Centre of Excellence for Research, Risk Assessment and Training, which I know other colleagues and Five Eyes countries are doing similar things, including New Zealand. So that's pretty much us in a nutshell, Hala.
Thank you so much. So the Centre for Prevention Programs and Partnerships sits within the Department of Homeland Security. And our approach, we have pieces of the approaches of all of my colleagues here, but our approach really focuses on the idea that prevention is most powerful, closest to the person at risk of radicalizing to violence. So when we think about it in this way, we think about what are the ways in which we can build resilience in individuals and communities. What ways can we bring together communities to empower them to protect the people that live within those communities from radicalizing to violence? And we do this by offering educational, technical, and financial assistance. Like many of my colleagues, we have a grant program that we fund. We, in fact, just announced $20 million more in grants that were given out on, I believe it's Thursday, the 15th. And many of those grantees are actually here at this conference, so it's really great for us all to be able to connect in person. But those grantees are doing a variety of things that are enabling prevention across the country. The other thing that we do is provide regional prevention coordinators. So we have a cadre of folks that work within CP3, but are not headquartered in DC like I am, but are instead across the country working shoulder to shoulder with practitioners, with state and local law enforcement, with state and local governments, with schools, with social workers and other officials and other programs within communities across the country to help build up that resilience in those communities. Now, we don't come in from the government, it's not, we're from the government, we're here to help. We can act as a convener and a generator of the conversation. So in communities where prevention work is either nascent or non-existent, we can act as a catalyst that brings together the disparate parts to start talking to each other. We also offer educational and training opportunities through our community awareness briefings and other briefings that we can provide to communities to help train themselves. And then, it's a train the trainer kind of offering, so that they're not just training the people that are living and working in their communities, but they're then training others to be able to spread information about prevention. So that's educational, that's financial, and then technical assistance is through a variety of matters. We do have part of our organization that does policy and research, so policy development and research that helps us enable our work and make sure that, just as Vanessa has said and Andy and Tim have said, that our work is based in a whole of society, public health informed approach, so that we're looking at how can we ground the work that we're doing in data, and how can we learn from similarly, hopefully successful programs that have looked at public health issues such as suicide prevention, gun violence prevention, etc. How are we taking the lessons from those programs into the work that we're doing? We also, I've talked about grants, I've talked about regional prevention coordinators. And we also do our own form of training through our digital forums, which are massive, usually 2 and 3 day long events where we bring together organizations from across the country and across the globe to provide technical support for communities, specifically dealing with online threats. So we help a community that isn't necessarily geographically located, but is based on sector. So different sectors, we've just done one for the education sector, we've done one for the gaming sector, specifically bringing together both the people who participate in that sector and people who participate in online platforms to have conversations around how they can work together to prevent radicalization to violence online. So I'm going to stop talking because I think I have to. But I'll move us into our next question, which is, what is something that you think your country does uniquely well in this prevention space? What is an innovative approach that you're doing that you think is particularly powerful? And this time I'm going to go backwards, so I'm going to start with Tim.
Thanks, Hala. From a home affairs perspective, I think one of the unique things that that we do is really the positive alternative narratives that are delivered in the strategic communication programs to contest the appeal of terrorist and violent extremist narratives. But we don't do it through, I think, counter narratives per se. Our approach avoids the sort of adversarial counter narrative approach and rather focuses on delivering sort of positive alternative narratives to engage individuals early and address some of the underlying issues that might lead to radicalisation of at-risk individuals, really with the aim of trying to stop radicalisation before it starts. And those narratives really aim to disrupt extremist narratives indirectly, addressing some sort of underlying biases and grievances and challenges, and providing alternative viewpoints to sort of redirect people rather than aiming to sort of attack or dismantle the extremist narratives directly. And our approach uses a range of role models that are credible and of interest to the target audience. It won't surprise you to know that research indicates that government voices can lack some credibility with some of our target audiences. So therefore, having credible messages and influencers to deliver some of those narratives are really important. So what we have is a couple of key programs, which I know colleagues are aware of, but one of them is called Wrapped, which is really designed to focus on, challenge the appeal of religious extremist narratives. And that's Wrapped spelled R-A-P-T with an exclamation mark if you want to Google it. And it really focuses on providing content that showcases positive experience and resilience of young Muslim Australians and their connectedness to Australian community, and really reinforce the idea that it's possible to be a good Australian and a good Muslim at the same time. And we've also got another program which is really focused on the sort of IMVE or the nationalist and racist violent extremist narratives. And it's called Fearlessly Australian, which was recently launched in September last year. And that's an online platform consisting of website, podcasts and videocast series, and goes across all the main sort of social media channels. And that's a platform hosted by a champion Australian boxer, Danny Green. It's designed to engage young Australians and really contest the appeal of nationalist and racist narratives through having a whole bunch of positive role models come and speak with Danny Green, who are going to deliver content that's sort of pretty frank and raw and informative. And it's not a very government message, as you'll see if you have a look at it, but it really is about dealing with adversity and strong, authentic Australian values delivered by the role models and the influencers themselves. And there's no sort of government voice that sits in those strategic communications products. And the WRAPT program's been running since August 2016. And that's been a really successful and strong program. And Fearlessly Australian, as I said, is pretty new, but we're really pleased with how that's going. We've been funded to continue both of those for the next few years, given the success that they've had so far.
That's great, Tim. And I've had the privilege of seeing some of those materials, and they are very powerful. And I think, especially Fearlessly Australian, speaks to the idea of the best counter speech is more speech, right? It's not censoring speech, but it is adding a positive speech. And so I think that it's really interesting. It'll be interesting to see what comes of those programs and the data that comes out of it. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Hala. So I think the backdrop for all of our work here in New Zealand in this space is the Christchurch terror attacks of 15 March 2019. I want to acknowledge the people who died that day. New Zealand once naively thought that we were somehow protected, I think, from these issues, that terrorist attacks were things that only ever happened elsewhere, but that changed. Everything changed for us in 2019. And the ramifications of that day for us are profound and long-term, and of course a lot of internal thinking through a formal Royal Commission report, but conversations throughout the country about how we approach these things. And our response to this very deliberately takes that whole of society approach. The government has a crucial role to play in this, but there are many, many things that we cannot, should not be the ones delivering. So we've moved since 2019 to a model where we work much more in partnership with the public, with communities, with civil society organisations, the private sector, local government and others. And I know that none of that is unique, because I think this summit highlights exactly that everybody has a role to play, but focusing on reducing and mitigating the risks of all kinds across the country is key, and trusted partnerships across that range of sectors, especially those outside government, are crucial for us for the success and positive impact of all of our prevention initiatives. A key part of this for us here in New Zealand is the central role that Māori, our tangata whenua, our people of the land, our Indigenous people here have in society and in the country. We are working much, much more closely with Māori at all levels, whether that's formal leadership levels or individuals who are working on the ground to develop approaches in particular to help us to consider ways to find unity in diversity. That's a journey for us in the relationship between government and Māori. Is complex, but it's been a real step forward to even be having some of those discussions. And I've been learning a lot about those connections to communities over the last 12, 18 months as I've travelled around the country and via Zoom through the pandemic, talking to communities, Indigenous Māori, faith, ethnic, LGBTI communities, young people, older people, and communities that are diverse in so many different ways. And these are people that were not in this conversation previously, certainly not here in New Zealand, as well as relating their concerns and their lived experience firsthand. So stories of hate, discrimination, physical violence, but also other kinds of slow violence. Many community members have also offered solutions to us, and that's where these conversations were most fruitful, I think. An example of this very, very collaborative approach to the work that we've been taking this year is developing a strategy for our national prevention approaches. Central to this has been a multi-sector working group, and we've had co-leads for that group. Though the work is in part led by government, we've had co-leads from outside government working to drive the strategy's development. The working group has had members from a wide range of backgrounds, including academics, researchers, and those with civil society and community perspectives. So they've not only assisted, but really been right at the forefront of helping to develop our principles and our outcomes. And they led the consideration and unpacking of aspects such as the process of radicalisation, what has and has not worked internationally, very, very importantly for us, human rights perspectives, and Māori approaches to building identity and conflict resolution. So we did a huge volume of public and community engagement for developing this piece of work, over 50 large meetings across the country, which is a very large amount considering New Zealand's roughly the same size as one of the smaller US states. So the challenge for us now is how we continue that momentum by supporting communities and civil society organisations to deliver those prevention initiatives at a local level. I couldn't agree more with the statement, Hannah, that intervention is most powerful when it's closest to the individual. So it's how do we enable through funding and support those people who are closest to individuals to be providing that and upskilling them to do so. So by working collectively as a nation, that's the heart of our approach, working together to ensure everyone both is safe but also feels safe and secure and has a positive sense of belonging, as well as being supported to play a role in prevention and all of this work. So, waiho I te tuputu kawa I te tōroa, let us keep close together, not wide apart. Thank you.
I think that's really important and a good reminder that government not only can't do this alone, but shouldn't do it alone, that government is not the seat of all answers, that we need to be working with a whole variety of sectors of organizations and individuals to solve this problem. It's a society-wide problem, therefore it needs to be a society-wide solution, and that includes the people who have historically been marginalized or not included in the mainstream conversation. So I think it's very interesting. You also mentioned the Christchurch call to action. Obviously, New Zealand has been a leader, specifically in the online space, through the Christchurch call to action. I think we can all commend you for that. I do, however, have a bone to pick with you since the Christchurch call to action summit is happening tomorrow. And many of us are trying to find a way to do it all. So, but that's fine. We can talk about that later. Vanessa, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Hala. So that's hard to follow up from Andy and Tim's comments, but perhaps I'll say two things with respect to something Canada is doing that is potentially unique in this space. And I think the first is, again, sort of in line with what we were discussing earlier, we have very much an integrated approach to our countering radicalization to violence, both organizationally and sort of nationally. So as an organization, we are integrated in terms of having both our research side, which Brett Kubicek, whom you heard from earlier today, leads, and they do a lot of very important work on the Community Resilience Fund and working with partners and frontline practitioners and researchers in that space. And then my team that leads on the legislative and policy aspects of countering radicalization to violence. So in that respect, we very much take a sort of a hand-in-glove kind of approach to tackling violent extremism and CRV, in that we recognize that building that evidence base and seeing kind of what works and what doesn't work is really essential in developing policies and legislative components for CRV. And then secondly, maybe what I'll say is, again, probably not too unique, I guess, based on what we've heard, but again, really reiterating that whole of society approach. So we really strive to work closely with our provinces and territories. For example, I co-lead a FPT, a Federal Provincial Territorial Countering Radicalization to Violence working group with my colleague from British Columbia, who is here today too. And we really seek to coordinate national efforts on countering radicalization to violence in that group. We also have a national expert committee on CRV, which serves really as sort of an advisory body for our minister in terms of formulating policies that are relevant to CRV. All of the candidates on that committee come from a diverse array of backgrounds, whether geographic or professionally. We have some that are former law enforcement, some that are clinical psychologists, academia, researchers, so it's a great breadth of knowledge. And then, of course, we have our Community Resilience Fund that I spoke about earlier, which does some really key work with organizations such as CPN Prev, which is a national prevention network that looks to collaborate on, again, sort of that what works in the space, what doesn't work, putting intervention teams in touch with one another, and also another service called Yorktown Family Services, which dispatches mobile prevention services. So I think those two are sort of like the key that kind of underpin our approach, and I think make us a bit unique in that regard.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing when there's overlap in the things that we're proud of in the work that we're doing, or maybe proud of is not the right way, but that we think are particularly unique or successful. Because I think that overlap demonstrates that we're all kind of, finding the right path, right? Or I'd hope so. I think there's enough distinction and I think there's enough difference that we're each doing what's right for our own nation, but also, as Andy pointed out, this is a global issue as well, because the internet has made it where borders are no barrier, right? So I don't think it's necessarily bad when something is not particularly different. We all do it in our different ways. And I'd say for the United States, what I think is one of our strongest unique approaches is our regional prevention coordinators. Having people who are federal employees but who are living and working within communities across the country, I think is a particularly powerful way of showing that we're trying to support communities, and doing that by building relationship, not just professional relationships, but by living in a community, by getting to know that community, and getting to know what that region needs, what the particular threats and risks and vulnerabilities, but also opportunities are in the particular area. Because no prevention strategy, it's not one size fits all, right? As much as there's the overlap that we just talked about, each community, each region, each state in our case, has their unique sort of push and pull factors. And we have to be cognizant of that. And the best way to do that is by being part of that community. So I think our regional prevention coordinators are a really strong way of being, as I like to say, shoulder to shoulder with the people who are both working to prevent people from radicalizing to violence and the people who are vulnerable to radicalizing to violence. And so as we're building out, right now we're in the process of building out state strategies. So state level strategies that the states sort of organize for themselves, but that bring together all of those different parts, all of those different players. It's really important to have someone on the ground who can communicate back to headquarters or communicate back to DC or to the Capitol and say, like, look, they got to do it differently. They need to do it their way. And here's why, and so that we can have that conversation rather than just sort of saying you got to do it one way. So I think the regional prevention coordinators are a really powerful tool in our arsenal. So now I have to turn, and we only have about less than 15 minutes. We started a little late, so less than 15 minutes left. But I want to turn now to what is a really particularly tricky question for all of us, and that is metrics. How do you measure success? Because how do you, in the instance of prevention, you're trying to measure like the absence of something, right? So what are, and let's do it quickly because I do want to get to another question that I think is really powerful too. What are some useful metrics that you're either using or considering? Vanessa, I'll start with you this time.
Sure. Thanks, Hala. Yeah, that is a difficult question. Absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately the end goal for everybody in this room is really the prevention of a violent incident. But I think that being said, I think firstly it's important to note that the absence of a violent incident is not sort of the only measure. There's certainly other ones as well. And I think particularly, as I was mentioning earlier, for us, it's really that building of that knowledge base, that building of the evidence base that's really essential to the work that we do. And I think one sort of, I guess, concrete way that we try to do that at the Canada Centre is through the administration of surveys. So we're right now in the process of kind of tabulating what we've heard in the last year from respondents, but it's mainly our CRF recipients and other key stakeholders. But as we're sort of going through it and distilling, we're seeing that the two key sort of themes that keep coming up again are building that knowledge base, building the evidence base rather, and also sort of looking at what sort of what works and what doesn't work. So I think to that point, again, that integrated approach that we were speaking about earlier, I think is also, a key measure of success. The more that we can inform society, whether it's law enforcement or schools or practitioners, I think that in and of itself is a key measure in terms of pushing the needle and making sure that societies and people working with individuals who are at risk are knowledgeable about what the key indicators and risk factors are. And maybe I'll say, just to conclude, one last, especially in the online space, we do quite a bit of work with our CRF funds, for example, Tech Against Terrorism. And one key component of their work is their TCAP, their terrorist content analytic platform. And they released some very, very interesting stats about the number of sites that they've taken down, the number of alerts that they've received. I've jotted down just a few that we could glean. As of recently, there were over 18,000 URLs that were submitted, for example, that contain terrorist content, and over 11,000 were submitted to over 65 tech companies. So, looking at some of those metrics, I think particularly in the online space is very, very useful, and we're proud to be supporters of organizations like that, those efforts.
Absolutely, and that goes back to what we were talking about before about needing to work with other organizations because, speaking for the U.S. government, we can't necessarily collect that information either like resource-wise or legally, right? So having organizations that can, like Tech Against Terrorism and others, who can analyze that data and understand it and help us understand how much are we actually moving the needle, right, is incredibly important and useful. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Hala. We certainly don't have a well-established model in New Zealand for doing this. And I'm as interested as anybody in how we can measure success in these areas. I think for me, understanding what success looks like and measuring this is really important. We need to look at every level of the prevention space. So from our work protecting and supporting individuals that are down or heading down a path to radicalisation to violence. So looking at how we can measure disengagement, I think we're relatively fortunate because our numbers are relatively low there that we can look at individuals and individual interventions, but there's still challenges there on genuinely measuring disengagement approaches through, as we've talked about, like kind of countering messages of hate and intolerance to addressing some of the underlying causes of violent extremism, which then goes into the social space. And there are some better established metrics there. There's one area, though, I think that's been a particular focus for us over the last couple of years, which was just a very basic one in that underlying space, which was that we simply weren't recording hate crimes here in New Zealand, which was, I think, shocking and appalling to most of us, that we simply did not know the nature and extent of this. So how can you, if you don't know what the nature of the problem is and how it changes over time, design effective interventions or measure success? So We've had a new programme of work to establish by our police force here, New Zealand Police, to make it far, far easier for victims and their families to report hate crime, but also, most importantly, training for our nationwide police force and all the officers to be able to recognise, properly record and respond to that hate crime, as well as building the response mechanisms, and then very importantly the analysis around that to understand what the nature of the problem is. It's early days there, but this was a basic tool that when some of us found that it didn't exist, we worked pretty hard to get that in place. More broadly, and similarly, we've talked about surveys, but one of the measures we've started to use is public confidence in our approach. We run a national security public survey. It covers a broad range of national security issues, but clearly one of those is terrorism and violent extremism. And the result from earlier this year was generally indicated strong confidence in our counter-terrorism work and approaches. We don't take that for granted by any means, and whether that confidence remains high will be one of the key measures for us. Thank you.
Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Hala. Look, I think, like all colleagues here, program evaluation is an area that we're really keen to mature. We have had a national CVE evaluation framework that we funded and delivered to support program evaluation in our states and territories. That was delivered in May 2017. So as you can tell, it's probably due for a refresh given the change in our programs and in the threat environment. And we'll be doing so in the context of designing and implementing the new CVE initiatives that I spoke about earlier. And one of the things that we really want to do as we sort of underpin the program design and delivery is really focus on data and having an evidence base, both for the design but also the measurement of success as those programs are implemented. But in terms of how we measure success at a number of levels, at a sort of national program level, we commissioned the Australian Institute of Criminology to review our CVE framework and initiatives nationally in 2020. The findings of that review really largely informed some of the new initiatives that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the intervention programs, as others have said, it's very difficult to measure the absence of something happening. However, one of the ways we measure success through those intervention programs is really the use of risk assessment tools on a case management basis, whereas we're measuring that risk longitudinally as someone is progressing through intervention programs. Clearly we want to be seeing those risk indicators tracking downwards and people going through those programs and successfully exiting far less inclined to extremist violence than when they commenced those programs. So I think broadly on a case management level, we can measure success through the successful sort of throughput through those programs and people exiting successfully. But on a community awareness level, we're also looking at surveys and ways in which, from our perspective, I'm really keen to measure the success of some of our new programs, based on what I expect will be an increase in community referrals for our early intervention program, because at the moment, our programs are still largely, the bulk of the referrals are coming from traditional sort of law enforcement referrals where, law enforcement and security agencies are referring individuals for intervention that have been identified through the course of their work. Increasingly, we're getting community-led referrals, and in fact, education sector is probably the second most common referral pathway for individuals, in particular minors that are identified as being vulnerable. But really, I think it'll be an evidence or a measure of whether our programs are identifying and referring vulnerable people earlier in the radicalisation spectrum if we are getting increasing community-based referrals for very early intervention rather than largely having those referrals driven by law enforcement, which while necessary, is sort of a signal that we're getting them a bit further down the radicalisation pathway than ultimately we would like. So some of those new programs, including our CVE community grants programs, as well as the expanded Living Safe Together model, is really focused at that very early intervention stage. So we would hope that that the data shows that those community interventions or referrals are increasing as community awareness grows. So that's something we hope to be sort of measuring in the years to come.
Yeah, I think I think interventions and referrals are like a very sort of like tangible marker of a certain kind of success, right? For us, because we're doing primordial prevention, we're doing prevention, at a very early stage. It's very tricky because you're not referring people necessarily. So you're sort of like, how do you measure the building of resilience? Some of it is public confidence, like you were talking about, Andy, trying to figure that out. But right now, we're sort of undergoing a review of how we do metrics and what are better metrics for the work that we're doing. Obviously, adoption of a state strategy or adoption of a more local strategy by a community would be a measure of success, certainly. But then you have to measure within that, is that a successful strategy, right? Is that particular strategy successful? And then we're just into like a nesting doll of like metrics, right? Like how do you can say the strategy itself is successful, but then is the strategy successful, and then yada yada and so forth and so forth. And I'm going to blame it on time that I'm going to stop talking about metrics in the U.S. now. We have 1 minute. We do have a few folks in the audience, so I wanted to. Does anyone have a question in the audience? Okay, so we don't have any from the online either. So I'm going to quickly ask you all the last question that we have, which is, what is something we should be working on together? And because we now have 36 seconds, I would like you to be very, very, very brief. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. Well, I have a few, but I might cut to the key one, which I think is research. I know a lot of our colleagues here are investing in research. We've established a centre of excellence. I know Andy has done the same thing in New Zealand. I think we're experiencing similar attributes of the threat environment. Each country is different. Each community is different. But I think some of the drivers of the threat trends that we're seeing are clearly similar and cross borders, particularly those online. I think there's a real opportunity for Five Eyes countries in particular to not just sort of deconflict our research, but actively collaborate and join forces on that research so that we're not doing parallel or siloed efforts, but actually can combine forces on some of that really necessary sort of global trend analysis and also program research, not just sort of threat-based, but how we're actually designing and delivering programs to address those threats.
Thanks, Tim. Vanessa?
Thanks, Hala. So I won't reiterate, that was one of my key points as well that Tim had. It's a valid one. So maybe just to add to Tim's comments, I would also say engagement with youth, I think, will be central going forward. I think especially on the online side of things, looking at some of the work that various governments are doing in the youth space. For example, through our CRF, we fund a project through Media Smarts called My Voice is Louder Than Hate. So it seeks to essentially bolster e-literacy and build classroom materials for high school students to really challenge them to push back on some of the hateful content that they're seeing online. And then maybe lastly, I'll say, I think there's a great deal of work being done within our Five Eyes community on what I would maybe refer to as sort of overt forms of online harm. But I think some of the more pernicious, perhaps not more pernicious, but also pernicious ones have to do with the ones that kind of are under the radar, I would say, that are, your sort of dis and malinformation, things that are not being necessarily detected by platforms, AI, or human capacity, but are nonetheless harmful.
Thank you. And on your point about youth, we fund through a program called Invent to Prevent that brings together colleges and university and high school students to create responses and solutions to to terrorism and targeted violence, usually tech-informed or predominantly tech-informed. And it's a really powerful program to see what people who are, digital natives and who are immersed in the online space can come up with in a way that, those of us that are more calcified perhaps do not. Andy, over to you.
So I'll be a third voice of research, but I will also, I think, just emphasise that we simply need to continue sharing best practice, particularly after the pandemic. It's crucial that we reconnect both nationally and internationally. Personal relationships in this space are absolutely invaluable, and some of those have been lost over the last couple of years. So we need to re-establish them through events like this, Thomas, and just bringing people together. In general, I think we work pretty closely and well together across government, but I'd also just like to emphasise that we need to facilitate broader connections in the research space, definitely, but also in particular between civil society organisations working on prevention efforts. So they can get together to share best practice and what they've learned. So initiatives like Communities in Practice are things I think we should really look to promote and support.
And for the US, I would agree with all of that. I would also say that I think we, and this is something my colleagues who are on the DICOG have heard me say, is that I think we also in the online space need to move beyond content and move beyond content, that kind of thing, but move into the space of how are we enabling platforms or how are we encouraging platforms to be sort of global citizens and to be forces for good and positive voices versus just addressing the content that's on platforms. So that's one. And then the other thing, and I think this is to Andy's point about the collaboration, I think if we can do study visits, if we can, really come to each other's countries and see how that work is being done. This is not just a plug for me to get over to New Zealand and Australia, I promise. But that we can go and sit with each other and see how these things work in practice. It's a sharing of best practices, and it's a sharing of culture that I think as we move into more and more of a global thought about this work will be really helpful in continuing those conversations. So we're so far over, they won't even show me how much. So I think this will conclude our panel. I really want to thank my fellow panelists, and I really want to thank Eradicate Hate for bringing us all together and bringing us into the larger group to have these important discussions. And I will be talking to most of you later this month at DICOG. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.